My name is Robert Hull, and at 58 years old, I thought I had seen the best and worst that life could offer. I grew up in a small Oregon town, tucked between foggy pine forests and winding rivers that carried stories older than anyone alive. Folks there still believed in simple things. A man's name mattered. A handshake was a contract. You kept your word even if nobody else was watching. That was the world that raised me. That was the world I'd built my entire life around. And for most of my years, I believed I had done right. I worked with my hands every day, waking up before dawn, letting the cold air wake my bones while the world was still quiet. I spent my life building things that stood firm long after I had finished the job. Houses, fences, porches, barns, anything you could put nails and sweat into, I could create it. People trusted me because I never cut corners. I never lied. I never walked away from a job unfinished. I always thought that if I lived that way, my son would look at me someday with pride and say that his father was a man worth respecting. But life has a way of turning on you when you least expect it. On the day everything changed, I wasn't doing anything special. I was standing near the kitchen counter, sorting through a stack of old mail, trying to ignore the dull throb in my lower back that never really left me after my injury. My son Ethan walked into the room with that restless look he had picked up somewhere along the road to adulthood. He had grown taller, sharper, colder. Gone was the boy who once tagged along behind me with a toy hammer in his hand, pretending he was helping me fix the world. This version of him had eyes that didn't see me anymore. Not the real me, not the man who raised him. He stood there, staring at me with this strange mix of impatience and disappointment. And before I could ask what was wrong, he said the words that still echo in my skull like a hammer hitting sheet metal. "You are useless now." He didn't shout it. He didn't hesitate. He spoke those words with the calmness of someone who had thought them for a long time before finally letting them slip out. His voice had no tremor of regret, no softness of hesitation, just a flat, irritated certainty that felt like a blade sliding under my ribs. The second he said it, something inside me went still. Not quiet, not numb, just still, the way the world pauses right before a thunderstorm tears open the sky. I remember looking at him, really looking at him, trying to find the boy I once knew somewhere in his expression. But all I saw was a young man who no longer valued the very person who had given up everything to make sure he had a better life. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold, and his posture stiff like he was standing in front of a stranger he didn't know how to tolerate anymore. I felt something heavy sink inside my chest, something I didn't know how to lift. Those 3 words didn't just hurt. They broke pieces of me I didn't even know were fragile. For half a second, I wondered if I had heard him wrong, if maybe stress or frustration had pushed him toward a mistake. But the look on his face told me the truth. He meant it. He believed it. He had been carrying that thought for a while, waiting for the moment to spit it out. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles went white. 1,000 memories flashed through my mind in the span of a breath. His first bike, his first day of school, his excitement when I took him fishing at dawn, the nights I stayed awake fixing broken toys, the sacrifices I made to pay for his education, the holidays I worked so he could have gifts under the tree, the promises I kept, the dreams I built for him. It all crashed together like waves in a storm, and yet, in that heavy moment of betrayal, Something else rose inside me, something stronger than the pain. I might be older, my hair might be turning grey, my steps might be slower, and I might not understand every new thing in the world like I once did, but I am not useless. Not then, not ever. I knew it deep down in the same place where I kept every lesson my father taught me. A man's worth is not measured by how fast he moves or how young he is. It is measured by his heart, his integrity, his resilience. And if my son had forgotten that, then I was going to remind him in a way he would never forget. He didn't know that the words he thought would tear me down would instead light a fire inside me that had been dim for far too long. He didn't know that he had awakened a part of me that refused to be discarded or overlooked. He didn't know that the father he had just insulted was still the same man who had climbed roofs in snowstorms, rebuilt whole houses with broken hands, and carried him through every tough season of his childhood. That day wasn't the end of my story. That day was the beginning of a new one. A story carved out of betrayal so sharp it left scars across my heart, and a revenge so controlled, so steady, so quietly powerful that it would teach my son a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. And now, I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Before everything in my life took that sharp turn downward, before the word useless came out of my own son's mouth like a knife thrown without warning, I was a man people trusted, a man who built more than houses. I built a reputation that stretched through every corner of our small Oregon community. My name carried weight, not because I was rich, not because I was powerful, but because I was dependable in a way that mattered. Folks didn't call me Old Reliable Rob just for fun. They meant it. They said it with respect in their voices, like it was a badge I'd earned inch by inch, year by year. Through sweat and calluses and early mornings when the sky was still, dark and cold enough to bite through your jacket, I spent more than 3 decades working as a construction contractor. Not a big-time developer, not someone with shiny machines or corporate crews, just a man with strong hands, a good toolbox, and a belief that honest work was the backbone of a good life. If I said I'd fix your roof, I fixed it. If I said I'd rebuild your deck, it got done. If I promised a family their home would be ready before winter hit, I worked through every kind of weather to make sure they had a warm place to sleep before the first snow fell. It didn't matter if I was sick, tired, or dealing with my own troubles. When people depended on me, I showed up. I remember climbing onto roofs during snowstorms, my fingers stiff and numb, the wind pushing hard like it wanted to throw me off. But roofs don't wait, leaks don't pause, and families don't stop needing warmth just because the weather turns angry. So I held on tight, hammered through the cold, and worked until my shoulders ached deep into the night. I didn't do it for praise or awards. I did it because that's the way I was raised. You don't leave folks hanging. You don't abandon your responsibilities. And you sure don't let others sit in the cold while you sit in comfort. I worked weekends, holidays, birthdays, even the nights when everyone else was at home with their families or resting after long days. I showed up before sunrise and didn't stop until the job was done right. My father used to tell me that doing something halfway was the same as not doing it at all. So I made sure everything I touched was something I could stand behind with my name attached. There are houses standing today in my town, solid and strong, because I put every bit of effort I had into building them. People walk through those, doors and lived their lives in the spaces I created without even knowing my name, and that never bothered me. That was the beauty of the work. It didn't need applause to matter, and for a long time I thought my son Ethan saw that. I thought the long nights, the hard days, the sacrifices were more than proof of love. I thought they were lessons. He grew up watching me build things from scratch. He'd sit on my shoulders as a little boy while I showed him how a frame turned into a wall, or how a simple set of plans turned into a home. I'd give him small jobs to make him feel included. Hand me that wrench. Hold this nail. Steady that board. He'd smile with his whole face, proud that he was helping his old man. He used to tell people at school that his dad could fix anything. I remember those moments like they're carved in stone. The way he looked at me, like I was 10 feet tall, like I was invincible. I wanted him to learn pride the same way I did, not through bragging or fancy talk, but through action. I wanted him to understand that doing things the right way meant more than doing them fast or easy. I hoped he'd grow into a man who respected the value of effort, who knew that every good thing takes time and patience. And I believed, with my whole heart, that I was giving him the kind of foundation that would carry him through life. But life has a habit of shifting in ways you don't see coming. As Ethan grew older, his world stretched farther than mine ever did. He became the first person in our family to go to college. I'll never forget the day he got his acceptance letter. He came running into the kitchen with that boyish excitement that made him look 16 again, even though he was 18, and, trying hard to act, grown. I hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. I was proud in a way that felt bigger than words. I thought college would give him the opportunities I never had. I wanted him to go places, to see things, to experience a world far beyond our small town. I told everyone who would listen that my boy was going to change the world one day. And I meant it. To make it happen, I worked overtime until my hands shook from exhaustion. I took jobs far outside town when the local work slowed down. I sold my old fishing boat, the one thing I held on to after my wife passed, because I wanted him to have enough money to chase his dreams without worrying about debts. I told myself everything I was sacrificing was worth it because I was investing in him, in his future, in the life I hoped he'd build. But something changed while he was away. Slowly, bit by bit, Ethan became someone I hardly recognized. The more he studied in big cities, the more he met people who lived lives I couldn't imagine. The more he saw the world through eyes that didn't match mine anymore. He started talking differently, dressing differently, thinking differently. He grew distant, not in a rude way at first, but in a quiet, subtle way that made me feel like I was fading from his world. He never said anything outright, but I saw it. The silent judgment, the hesitation in his voice when he introduced me to his college friends, the way he rushed conversations whenever one of them walked by, the way he shrugged off my stories like they were too simple for the new world he was living in. I'd show up for his events wearing clean but simple clothes, and he'd shift uncomfortably, like my presence didn't fit the image he wanted to show the world. He used to brag about me when he was younger, but now he kept me at arm's length, as if he was embarrassed to have a father who worked with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was young, that he was growing, that he was learning who he wanted to be. I convinced myself that once he settled down, he would remember his roots. He would remember the man who raised him. He would understand that no amount of fancy talk or shiny city life could ever replace the honest backbone of hard work. But I never imagined that all those changes were leading to the moment that would break me. I never imagined that the same boy who once proudly wore a tool belt I bought him for his 8th birthday would one day look me in the eye and tell me I had no value left in his life. If I had paid more attention, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe I could have talked to him, helped him see the truth before pride and arrogance twisted his vision. Maybe the words that cut so deep would have never been spoken. But life doesn't give do-overs. And the man I used to be, the one built from decades of sweat and sacrifice, found himself standing in front of a son who no longer saw worth in him. And that realization hit harder than any hammer I ever held. Life has a cruel way of testing a man at the exact moment he thinks he has everything under control. For me, that moment came on a cold November morning. The kind where the fog sits so low you can't tell where the sky ends and the earth begins. I had taken on a small renovation job for an old client, just a porch replacement. Nothing I hadn't done hundreds of times before. But age doesn't send a warning before it hits. It creeps in quietly, then it strikes fast. I was lifting a stack of wooden planks, something I used to do without even thinking, when a bolt of pain shot through my lower back, like fire ripping down my spine. My legs buckled, the world tilted, and before I realized what was happening, I was lying flat on the frozen ground, staring up at the colorless sky, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to believe that my own body had betrayed me so suddenly. The doctor later said it was a severe lumbar strain, made worse by years of overwork and not enough rest. He told me I needed to stay off my feet, take pain medications, go through physical therapy, avoid heavy lifting, avoid bending, avoid everything that made me me. I was a man who had spent more than 3 decades climbing ladders, carrying lumber, hauling bricks, swinging hammers. Suddenly, I wasn't allowed to do any of it. It felt like someone had stolen the only language I ever knew how to speak. My tools sat untouched in the corner of my workshop, like loyal soldiers waiting on a general who could no longer lead them. Dust gathered on them slowly, cruelly, like time mocking me with every passing day. Money began slipping away faster than water through clenched fists. Savings I had worked for my whole life, money I planned to use for retirement, for peace, for the simple dignity of getting old without bothering anyone, started disappearing into hospital bills, medication costs, checkups, and therapy sessions. I tried applying for lighter work, something manageable, something that wouldn't strain my back, but no one wanted to hire a 58-year-old man with a medical restriction. Not when they could hire a 25-year-old who could lift twice as much and complain half as little. That was when Ethan said he would move back in, telling me it was because his new job was closer to our side of town. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think it was his idea, his choice, his desire to be close to his father again. I told myself that maybe this injury, awful as it was, might bring us together the way we used to be. I imagined us talking over dinner, watching old movies, fixing things around the house as a team. I hoped for a second chance, but hope is a fragile thing. Too fragile the first week he returned. Things were quiet. He kept to himself, stayed in his room, worked late hours, talked on the phone with friends who lived in nicer neighborhoods and had fancier lives. I would sit at the kitchen table waiting for him to join me for breakfast or dinner the way he used to, but his footsteps always moved in the opposite direction. The house I had built with my own hands felt smaller with him inside it, not because The walls had shrunk. But because the space between us had grown so wide, it swallowed every bit of warmth. That once lived there, he started making comments. Small ones at first, about how outdated the kitchen was, how dim the lights were, how old-fashioned the furniture looked. Each remark wasn't a dagger on its own, but they stacked up like firewood under a slow-burning flame. He acted like he was ashamed to be seen living there. I caught him more than once, hiding his address from friends or avoiding video calls unless he was outside or in his car. Then came the little sighs whenever I asked him for help. That exhausted exhale, like he was carrying the weight of the world. Because I asked him to pick up milk from the store or reach something from a top shelf I couldn't bend for anymore. I noticed the way he winced whenever he had to drive me to physical therapy, like every mile was a personal sacrifice he'd never get back. The way he'd walk ahead of me in public, never beside me, as though being seen with an aging father. With a cane would bruise his image. Every night, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him talking to someone on the phone, complaining about how complicated his life had become, how his father's situation was holding him back, how he wished he could just live freely without responsibilities dragging him down. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. The words hit me harder than the injury ever could. And then came the day everything snapped. The day everything fragile inside me shattered like a glass dropped on a stone floor. I remember I had struggled all morning, trying to fix a loose cupboard. Hinch because I didn't want Ethan to complain about things falling apart. It took me nearly an hour just to kneel down and get back up. When he came into the kitchen, I asked if he could help carry a small toolbox back to the garage. Just a toolbox. Something he used to play with when he was 5 years old, pretending to fix things alongside me. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at me with this mix of annoyance and disbelief, as though I was asking him for something unimaginable. And then, with a tone I will never forget, he said, "Dad, can you just stop? You're useless now. You can't do anything on your own. Just sit down and stop acting like you're still capable of anything." Useless. The word echoed in my chest, loud enough to drown out the air around me. It wasn't just an insult. It was the final blow to a man already fighting to hold himself together. I felt something tear inside, not in my back, not in my bones, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere that doctors couldn't diagnose or repair. That moment didn't just break me. It uncovered a truth I didn't want to face. My own son didn't see me as a father. Anymore, he saw me as a burden, as dead weight, as someone whose time had passed, and that was the moment everything changed. Not because of the pain he caused me, but because of what I decided to do next. I may have been broken, I may have been hurting, but I was not done. Not yet. I remember that afternoon with a clarity so sharp it still hurts to think about. The sky outside was a dull, heavy, grey-ther, kind that hangs low over a town, pressing its weight down on rooftops and hearts alike. Even the house felt different. That day, it was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that settles before a storm, thick and tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. I was sitting on the living room couch, with a basket of laundry beside me, trying to fold shirts slowly, carefully, one piece at a time. Every movement felt like it was being measured by an invisible judge. My back throbbed with every twist, every reach. It wasn't pain that made me move slow, it was pride trying to hide the pain. I didn't want Ethan to see how hard it had become for me to do something so simple, something I used to finish in 10 minutes without thinking. I hated that my own body had turned small tasks into mountains, but still, I kept going. It was the only way I knew how to fight back against the helplessness creeping into my life. That was when Ethan came home. The front door slammed open, louder than usual, and he walked in talking on his phone. His voice filled the space immediately, annoyed, rushed, as if the house was too small to contain him. He paced back and forth across the room like someone rehearsing anger, barely noticing anything or anyone around him. I watched him from the corner of my eye, hoping maybe he'd sit down for a moment. Maybe he'd share a meal with me. Maybe he'd talk like a son talks to a father. But instead, he barked complaints into his phone about work, about responsibilities, about how he was carrying too much. His words weren't meant for me, but they still sliced through the air like blades. He didn't see the laundry basket near the coffee table. His foot caught the edge, and the whole thing tipped over. Socks spilled across the carpet, a shirt slid under the table. The simple order I had worked so hard to maintain scattered in an instant. Ethan stopped, his face twisting with irritation as he turned sharply toward me. For a split second, I thought he'd laugh it off. Or maybe he'd apologize for stepping too fast, or sigh and pick something up. Just something human. But instead, he dropped the words that would echo in my chest for months afterward. Dad, you're useless now. You can't even take care of yourself. He didn't whisper. He didn't soften his tone. There was no hesitation, no guilt, not even a flicker of remorse. He said it like it was the truth he had been holding inside for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to throw it in my face. I looked up at him, praying that he would realize what he had just said, that maybe he'd catch the hurt in my eyes and take it back. But he didn't. He just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring at me like he didn't recognize me anymore, like I was just a broken object taking up space. He kept going, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. He said I was holding him back, said he couldn't focus on his career while babysitting me. Every word felt heavier than the last. He talked about the house being too small, too old, too depressing. He talked about how other people his age lived in high-rise apartments with city views, while he was stuck living with someone who needed constant help. He didn't look at me while he said these things. He looked away, as if the sight of me was something he couldn't bear. Then came the sentence that didn't just hurt it, hollowed me out. Dad, maybe it's time you leave the house to someone who can actually use it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt like the ground under the living room rug had disappeared. That house was more than wood and nails to me. It was the place where Ethan took his first steps, where his mother painted the nursery blue, where we celebrated Christmas after Christmas, with laughter bouncing off those very walls. It was where I stayed awake at night listening to his coughs when he got sick as a child. It was where I fixed every pipe, every crack, every loose board, putting pieces of myself into every corner, and now my own son wanted me out of it. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the laundry basket. I didn't argue, even though every part of me wanted to remind him of the sacrifices I made, the years I gave, the love I poured into him and this home. But I had no strength left to fight with words. I just sat there for a long moment, staring at him, searching for the boy I raised, the boy who used to hug me with tiny arms, who used to fall asleep on my chest, who once believed his father could fix anything. All I saw in front of me was a man I didn't recognize, so I stood up slowly, holding onto the side table for support. My back screamed in pain, but my heart hurt so much more. Without saying a word, I walked past him and went to my room. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before, as if the house itself was pushing me away too. I closed the door behind. Mian sat on the edge of my bed, letting the weight of everything settle onto my shoulders like a cold blanket. That night, while the house was silent, I packed a small bag. Just a few clothes. My old toolbox, even though I didn't know if I'd ever be able to use it again, and one framed photo Ethan at 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders with a smile so bright it could have lit the darkest night. I held that picture for a long time before placing it gently in the bag. By morning, before the sun had fully risen, before Ethan even woke up, I walked out the front door with that small bag in my hand. I didn't slam the door. I didn't leave a note. I didn't look back. But while I walked down that quiet street with cold wind biting at my face, one thought kept burning hot in my mind. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. He had no idea that the man he pushed out would rise again, stronger, smarter, and ready to teach him a lesson he would never forget for as long as he lived. Starting over at 58 wasn't something I ever imagined doing, especially not after being shoved out of my own home by the one person I had spent my whole life raising and protecting. But life has a strange way of stripping a man down to nothing just so he can discover what he's truly made of. When I drove away that morning, the world outside my windshield looked unfamiliar, like someone had taken the life I knew and wiped it clean with one harsh stroke. I didn't have a destination in mind. I didn't have a plan. I just kept driving. Until the road curved into the woods where my late brother's old cabin sat like a forgotten memory tucked between tall pines. The cabin wasn't much. The paint had peeled off years ago. The porch sagged on one side like it was tired of holding itself up. The inside smelled of wood, rot, dust, and loneliness, but it was quiet. It was isolated. And most importantly, it belonged to my family. For the time being, it was a place where I could exist without judgment, without someone calling me useless, without feeling like a ghost walking through the halls of a house that no longer wanted me. The first night I slept there, the cold slipped through the gaps in the window frame and chilled my bones, but I didn't complain. After the pain of hearing those words from my own son, physical discomfort felt small. I lay on that old mattress, staring at the ceiling with its water stains, forming strange shapes, and wondered how a life built on sacrifice could fall apart so fast. I wondered where I had gone wrong, what I had missed, and how a father could end up exiled by the child. He loved more than anything in this world. I didn't have much money left after my injury and the bills that followed. I didn't have the strong back I once did. I didn't have anyone checking on me, calling me, worrying about me. But I had something more important than all of that. I had skills sharpened by decades of hard work, sweat, and doing things the right way. And skills don't vanish just because someone decides you're no longer useful. Skills don't care about age or pain or insults. They stay with you like old friends who refuse to let you fall apart. So I made a quiet promise to myself that morning, I wasn't going to let my story end with my son's cruel words. If he believed I was nothing, I would rebuild myself until the whole world saw the opposite. I started every day at dawn, even when my back felt stiff enough to snap in. I walked slow loops around the cabin, breathing the cold forest air, forcing my body to wake up and remember what strength felt like. Then I opened my old toolbox, the same one I taught Ethan to use, and I began fixing things one tiny step at a time. First, I replaced the rusty hinge on the cabin door. The sound of it swinging smoothly again made something warm flicker in my chest. Then I repaired the window frame, sanding the wood until it felt new under my fingertips. I climbed the ladder carefully and patched up the roof, each nail a reminder that I wasn't finished yet, that I still had more to give. It wasn't easy. My back protested every move. Some days I had to sit for long stretches just to steady my breathing, but I kept going. Every small repair was like stitching myself back together. Weeks passed, and slowly the cabin changed. The walls felt sturdier. The floor stopped creaking under my weight. The porch stood straight again. One afternoon while I was repairing the gutters, a pickup truck rolled into the clearing and parked near the tree line. A man stepped out, wiping his hands on his jeans, looking around like he was sizing up the place. He introduced himself as Tom, a local rancher. He said he'd been driving by the cabin for weeks on his way to his property and noticed the changes. He told me he admired the way I was restoring the old place and asked if I was willing to take on a small repair job for him. I hesitated, telling him I didn't move as fast as I used to. My back wasn't the same. I couldn't promise quick work. He just smiled, the kind of smile only honest country folks give, and said something that hit me right in the heart. Speed doesn't matter. Good work does. That simple sentence felt like a lifeline being tossed to a drowning man. I agreed to help, expecting it to be a one-time thing. But once I rebuilt Tom's shed, he told his neighbor. Then that neighbor told another. And word spread quietly across the county the same way it had back in my younger days. Old, reliable Rob was working again. People didn't care about my age. They didn't care about my bent posture or the scars time had carved into my hands. They didn't care that I needed to take breaks or move slowly. They cared that I showed up, did the job right, and spoke to them with respect. Something my own son had forgotten how to do. With every shed I fixed, every fence I mended, every porch I restored, a piece of my confidence came back. While Ethan saw me as a burden, strangers saw the value he couldn't see anymore. It hurt. I won't lie, it cut deeper than any injury I ever had. But there was healing in that hurt too, because months passed, and I wasn't just rebuilding cabins or sheds. I was rebuilding myself, my pride, my identity. And as I looked around that old cabin, one quiet evening, now repaired and warm and full of life again, I realized something important. I wasn't the one who lost anything that day. My son pushed me out. He was, and he would learn that harsh truth sooner than he ever expected. That morning began like any other quiet, slow, the kind of morning where the world still felt half asleep. I was sitting at the small wooden table inside the cabin, the one with a crooked leg that wobbled every time I leaned on it, sipping a cup of tea I had brewed with trembling hands. The cold outside seeped through the cracks in the windows, biting at my skin, but I didn't move. I just stared at the steam rising from the cup, trying to convince myself that the world hadn't completely changed. But the world had changed. I just didn't know how much until the phone rang. When I picked it up and heard Mr. Keaton's slow, heavy breathing, I knew something was wrong. He was not a man who wasted words. He had been my lawyer for nearly 27 years. Loyal. Calm, loyal to the law, and loyal to me. So when he spoke, I heard the seriousness before even understanding the words. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of something like disappointment mixed with disbelief. "Your son came by the office yesterday." At first, I thought maybe Ethan had gone to ask about the cabin, or maybe about the land taxes, or maybe, just maybe, about me. Some part of me, a foolish part that still clung to hope even after everything he had done, lifted its head. But then, Mr. Keaton continued, and every fragile piece of that hope cracked. He asked about property transfers. My grip tightened around the phone until my knuckles whitened. My heartbeat slowed to a stiff, heavy thud. Property transfers. He wanted to know, Keaton said with a long sigh, how to get your house legally under his name. He said you didn't need it anymore. I swallowed hard. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The words sat like burning coals inside my throat. I felt a numbness spread through my chest, slow at first, then sudden, almost violent. I had lived in that house for more than 3 decades. I had built its walls with my own hands, dug the foundations stone by stone, watched the paint dry, fixed every leak, planted the trees that now shaded its porch. That house wasn't just a building, it was the memory of a family I once thought I had. It was the memory of the son I raised, the man I thought he would become. But that version of him existed only in my imagination now. The real Ethan, the man who kicked me out of my own home. The man whose eyes had turned sharp with entitlement. The man who believed he deserved everything simply because he wanted it. Man had gone to my lawyer behind my back to take the last piece of my life. He said I didn't need it anymore. I repeated the words inside my mind, letting them echo, letting them bruise me from the inside. That wasn't something said out of anger. That wasn't something said in the heat of a fight. That was a decision. A premeditated, calculated act. He had been thinking about this long before the day he pushed me out like trash. That realization cut deeper than anything he had ever done. For a long moment, I said nothing. On the other end of the line, Mr. Keaton waited patiently, giving me space to absorb the betrayal. He must have known it would sting. He must have known it wasn't just paperwork, was a wound. Finally, in a voice that felt foreign coming, out of my mouth, I asked, what exactly did he want to do? Keaton cleared his throat. He asked about fast-tracking the transfer, wanted to know the easiest way to override family ownership. He tried to make it sound like you agreed to it, but I could tell he was lying. My chest tightened again, this time with something darker, something like understanding. So that day when he yelled at me, when he slammed the door behind me, when he told me I was in the way, it wasn't an outburst of frustration. It was strategy, a push, a shove, the first stage of his plan to get rid of me permanently. He didn't kick me out because he was angry. He kicked me out because he needed me gone. I stood from the chair, the wooden table shaking slightly under my hand. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in around me, squeezing all the air from my lungs. The betrayal was no longer a fresh wound. It was a deep, rotting one. My own son, plotting to take everything I built. I could feel the memories flash through my head, him sitting on my shoulders as a child. The birthday cakes I made with burnt edges, because I never learned to bake properly, the nights I stayed up when he was sick, the school fees I paid even when I barely had money for myself, memories that now felt like cruel jokes. I exhaled slowly and said only one thing: keep everything under my control. Don't let him sign a single paper. Not one. Keaton didn't hesitate. Of course. I'll make sure nothing moves without your consent. He had always been loyal, and in that moment, his loyalty felt like the last solid ground beneath my feet. After the call ended, the cabin was silent again. Too silent. The cold outside seemed to crawl into the room, slipping under the door, brushing against my skin. I sat down on the old couch, staring at the flame in the small stove, watching it flicker and twist like it was dancing to some broken rhythm. And that night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside the cabin walls, I let myself think. Not with rage, not with hatred. Those emotions had already burned themselves out. What was left was clarity, sharp, clean, almost painful in its honesty. Ethan hadn't become this person overnight. Maybe he had been changing for years. Maybe I had been too blind to see it. Maybe I didn't want to see it. Greed doesn't usually appear suddenly. It grows slowly, quietly, like mold spreading in the dark. And by the time you finally notice it, it's already everywhere. My son was no longer the boy I raised. He had turned into a man driven by desire, blinded by it. A man willing to take from his own father. A man who couldn't see the edge he was walking toward. Life doesn't always tap people on the shoulder and whisper lessons in their ear. Sometimes it slams them into a wall so hard the world spins. Sometimes it throws them off cliffs. Sometimes the only way someone wakes up is when they hit the ground. And soon, very soon, Ethan was going to fall. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Not because I planned revenge. Not because I pushed him. But because he kept pushing himself step by step toward the edge, believing he was too untouchable to slip. I watched the fire burn low, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel defeated. I felt something different. Something steadier. I felt ready, because the house he wanted to steal, the one he thought I didn't need, that house wasn't just a piece of land. It was my line in the sand, and Ethan was about to learn what happens when a man who has lost everything finally decides he has nothing left to lose. Time moved differently in that cabin. Days no longer felt like burdens. They felt like steps, small, steady steps away from the pain I had carried and towards something I didn't recognize at first: peace. Morning after morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh pine drifting through the windows and the quiet rustle of the forest. I worked small jobs, fixing fences, repairing roofs, helping old farmers mend broken machinery. Word spread fast, faster than I expected, and soon my name was being spoken again with respect, with trust, with something almost like admiration. People valued my work ethic, my reliability, the humility I had learned through suffering. And slowly, the cabin, my exile, my refuge, began to look less like a punishment and more like a retreat. I repaired the walls, oiled the old wooden floors, fixed a leaky roof, and planted a small garden outside. Nothing fancy. Just tomatoes, a few herbs, some flowers. But every time something sprouted, something bloomed, I felt a little piece of myself coming back to life with it. While I was rebuilding my world one small step at a time, My son's world was unraveling thread by thread. I didn't know at first. I wasn't watching him, wasn't asking about him, wasn't spying on him. I had learned painfully that chasing someone who didn't want you only led you into deeper hurt. But some news doesn't need seeking. It finds you on its own. One afternoon, while walking back from fixing a broken chicken coop for a farmer down the road, I ran into an old neighbor. She recognized me immediately, her eyes widening with the mixture of pity and curiosity that people try to hide but never really succeeded. She hesitated before speaking, as though she didn't know whether to share what she knew. But human nature has a strange way of delivering news whether the listener wants it or not. "I've seen your son around," she said carefully, lowering her voice. "He's not doing so well." I didn't ask anything, but she continued, "Anyway, because that's what people do when they have information burning holes in their tongues. He throws parties every weekend. Loud ones. The whole street hears them. He tells people he's inheriting the house soon. Bragging, actually." I looked at her silently, trying to keep my face still. Inside me, something twisted, something sharp and old and tired. She went on. "He's drinking a lot. Spending money like it doesn't cost anything. Says he's about to become wealthy. Says you'll be out of the picture soon." She didn't say it to hurt me. She said it because it was the truth. A truth people had been whispering in hallways and living rooms while I was out here living quietly with the sound of crickets and the smell of earth. When I went back to the cabin that evening, I sat for a long time staring at the small garden I planted. The soil was dark and damp, the new seedlings fragile but alive. I thought about Ethan, his arrogance, his entitlement, his foolish confidence in a future that didn't exist. He wasn't just dreaming. He was building his entire life around a fantasy he had convinced himself was inevitable. That my house, my property, the roof I built with my bare hands, would fall into his lap like a prize he never earned. A week later, another rumor reached me. Ethan had quit his job, a stable one. The kind people fight hard to get, the kind most people hold on to during difficult times. But he had thrown it away, because according to him, better things were coming. Better things. He meant my house. He meant the money he believed he would get when he sold it. He meant a business idea. He barely understood, but liked the sound of. He was living inside a daydream so fragile that even a whisper could break it. And reality had been whispering louder and louder. Then piece by piece, his perfect world began to crumble. The neighbor who told me about the parties also told me something else weeks later, that a tow truck had come to the house. Ethan's car had been repossessed in broad daylight, right in front of the people he used to brag to. He tried to argue, tried to swear, tried to threaten, but none of it mattered. The car was gone. Soon after, word spread that the credit card companies had started chasing him, calling him non-stop. Bills stacked higher than he could hide. Notices plastered across his front door. Letters warning of legal action. And then, the inevitable. The bank took him to court because he had maxed out credit he had no intention or ability of paying back. And the people he always surrounded himself with, the ones who filled the house with laughter and loud music, the ones who drank his alcohol, used his space, slept on his couch, and acted like they loved him. They vanished, stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped answering. They scattered the moment he had. Nothing left to offer, like birds that fly away when the seeds are gone. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate his downfall. In truth, a part of me felt the ache of watching your own blood destroy himself out of greed. But consequences do not pause for heartbreak. One night, long after I had closed my eyes, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing on the small table beside my bed. The clock beside it glowed 1:47 a.m. I hesitated before answering. Calls at that hour never bring good news. When I pressed the phone to my ear, I heard nothing at first but heavy breathing, shaking, uneven breathing, like someone trying not to cry. Then a familiar voice finally broke through. Dad, I can. You hear me? It was Ethan. But this wasn't the voice that had shouted at me the day he kicked me out. This wasn't the voice that mocked me, belittled me, claimed I was in the way. This voice was small, trembling, sounding almost like the little boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and tear-filled eyes because he had fallen off his bicycle. Except, he wasn't a boy now. He was a grown man, a man who had tried to take everything from me. Dad, I need your help. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something deeper, years of disappointment, betrayal, and silence wrapped into one heavy moment. But this time, I wasn't going to pick him up like before. I wasn't going to fix his mistakes with a snap of my fingers. Some lessons aren't learned through comfort. Some lessons are carved through consequences. And for the first time in his life, Ethan was facing the consequences he had created for himself. This time, I was not going to make the fall softer.
The diner sat just off the highway, a lonely place with neon lights flickering faintly in the early evening, the smell of fried food hanging heavy in the air. I had agreed to meet Ethan there because I knew he needed a place familiar enough to feel safe, yet isolated enough that he couldn't run from reality. When he arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled and worn, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had been pressing down on him for months, and in a way it had. The confident swagger he once carried like armor was gone, replaced by a fragile uncertainty that made his eyes look smaller, duller, as though someone had drained the light from them. He slid into the booth across from me, and for a long, silent moment, neither of us spoke. The din of the diner's small crowd, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of plates and silverware seemed to fade around us, leaving only the tension that had been building between us for years. Finally, he whispered, almost like he was afraid to say it aloud, "Dad, I messed up." The words hit harder than I expected. I stayed quiet, letting him spill the truth, listening to the confession that I had been waiting for without realizing it. He told me about every mistake, every gamble that had failed, every debt that had piled up higher than he could climb, the job he had walked away from, the bills he had ignored, the people he had let down, and the house he had tried to claim as his own without understanding what it really meant. His voice cracked, carrying the weight of shame and panic, and he kept repeating the desperate words that had brought him here. He needed the house, he needed the money, he needed me to save him from the mess he had created. But then he said something that cut sharper than all the others, a line that revealed his arrogance, his blindness, and his mistaken belief that he had already won before he had even begun. "I thought once I got the house," he admitted, "I could fix everything. I thought you didn't need it anymore." I leaned back slowly, letting the words sink into me, and for the first time I let him see it, the pain of betrayal, the quiet fire that had been burning under the surface ever since he shoved me out of my home. I looked straight into his eyes, and for once he couldn't hold my gaze. It was as though a switch had flipped, and the boy who had once demanded everything without giving anything in return was seeing, for the first time, the reality of what he had tried to destroy. I spoke carefully, my voice calm but edged with the weight of all those years of love, sacrifice, and hurt. Son, I needed that house more than you ever understood. Not because of money, not because of convenience, not because of anything you can measure with bills or property lines. I needed it because it held everything your mother and I built. It held our life, our memories, the sweat of my hands, the love I gave you. And you tried to take it without thinking twice. His head dropped almost immediately, shame pressing it down like a stone. I wasn't trying to destroy you, Dad, he muttered, voice barely audible. I thought you were done. I felt a slow breath leave my chest, the kind that carries away the tension of decades, and finally I said the words he needed to hear, words I knew would linger in his mind long after this moment had passed. I may be old, Ethan, but I'm not done, and I'm not useless. His head stayed lowered for a moment longer, then he looked up, eyes glossy, a storm of fear, regret, and realization swirling within them. He nodded slowly, understanding in some part of him what I had just told him, but I knew tears alone were not enough to repair what had been broken. This wasn't a moment for pity or forgiveness or easy absolution. He needed more than words. He needed change. He needed responsibility. He needed humility, a lesson he would never forget. And that, right there across that worn diner booth with the hum of life carrying on around us, that was where my plan began. The quiet, deliberate plan to rebuild him in the same way I had rebuilt myself, to make him understand through experience what respect, gratitude, and honor truly meant, and to ensure that the son who once called me useless would never again mistake my strength for weakness, or my love for weakness, or my silence for surrender. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it moves like the wind, slow, steady, impossible to see, yet impossible to ignore. That's how I chose to teach Ethan the lesson he had earned but never expected. I didn't shout at him. I didn't throw accusations in his face. I didn't recount every betrayal, every careless word, every moment he had treated me like a burden. That wouldn't have worked. That would have been loud, fleeting, and satisfying only for the moment. No, my revenge was different. It was quiet, deliberate, and precise. It was patience honed by decades of experience, sharpened by pain, and guided by the knowledge that true lessons sink in slowly, leaving marks deep enough to last a lifetime. I told him, firmly but without malice, that he could not return to the house. Not now, not ever, until he had earned the right to step inside those walls again. The house he had wanted to claim as his own would not be a prize. It would be a reward for the growth he had refused to seek. I offered him a job, not one of comfort, not one of easy recognition, not one that would pad his ego. I told him he would work alongside me, repairing cabins, rebuilding fences, mending barns, restoring sheds. Long, honest work that left the hands calloused, the back aching, and the mind tired but clear. The kind of work he had once scorned, the kind he had declared beneath me, with the arrogance only youth and ignorance can breed. I watched his pride flicker like a candle in the wind when I spoke, the last embers of his entitlement trembling. He hesitated. His mouth opened and closed as if he wanted to protest, to argue, to remind me he was a grown man now and deserved better. But the truth had cornered him. He had nowhere to go. No money, no friends, no options. And slowly, reluctantly, he agreed. That was the start. Day after day, the routine began. The mornings were long and silent, the air cold and heavy as we rose before the sun, the forest around the cabin still wrapped in fog and half-light. He lifted timber with hands that shook, hammered nails with fingers that blistered, scraped paint from boards, until the scent of old varnish and sweat hung thick in the air. His muscles screamed in protest. His back ached like mine once did, and every evening he returned to the cabin exhausted, his pride bruised and battered. But something inside him began to shift. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed it first in the quiet things, the way he listened when I gave instructions, the way he observed the tools and techniques I had taught him years ago, the way he started asking questions not out of defiance but out of curiosity. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, respect began to seep into his voice. Not the hollow respect people give when they feel forced, but the kind that grows quietly when the mind finally recognizes the value of what it once marked. He apologized in small ways, not with long speeches or hollow promises, but with action. He stayed late to fix a fence he hadn't been told to repair. He helped the farmer carry a heavy load without complaint. He learned to pace himself, to measure his strength, to take pride in work that didn't offer instant gratification but left lasting results. And with every task, every drop of sweat, every ache in his body, a part of the wall between us crumbled. The bitterness he had built up, the arrogance that had once seemed indestructible, began to wear thin under the quiet, relentless pressure of reality. And that was my revenge. Not to humiliate him, not to break him, not to punish him with words. My revenge was to make him see himself clearly, to rebuild the man who had tried to destroy me with his greed and arrogance, to make him understand what honor, hard work, patience, and humility truly meant. By the time the weeks became months, the transformation was undeniable. The boy who once spat "you're useless" across a living room now worked side by side with his father, earning every nail he hammered, every board he lifted, every drop of sweat he shed. And through that labor, he learned the one thing no words, no lectures, no threats could ever teach. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. Value isn't declared, it's proven. And the strength of a man isn't measured in the wealth he claims, but in the work he does, the people he honors, and the integrity he carries even when no one is watching. I didn't watch him carefully, not every second. I let him stumble. I let him struggle. I let him find the hard path himself. And that, more than anything, made the lesson permanent. Every ache, every blister, every tired, aching bone became a teacher. Every early morning and long, quiet evening of labor became a classroom he couldn't escape. By the time he finally looked at me, not with defiance, not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with understanding, it wasn't pride in himself he felt. It was the humility that comes only from surviving the consequences of one's own actions, from being broken down and slowly rebuilt by the hands of someone who refused to give up on you, no matter how undeserving you seem. And in that realization, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet satisfaction that was deeper than anger, sharper than revenge, and infinitely more lasting. Because my revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was perfect. It was patient, it was precise, and it worked, not by destroying him, but by creating the man he should have been all along. The son who once called me useless now understood in the marrow of his bones the weight of the words he had spoken, the cost of his arrogance, and the price of lost respect. And that was exactly how a father should teach his child the value of life, love, and labor. It had been a long journey, one that had worn at my bones, tested my patience, and reshaped not only my body but the very essence of who I was. A year had passed since that night in the diner when Ethan, desperate and broken, had finally reached out for help, his voice small and vulnerable, stripped of all the arrogance and entitlement that had once filled it. And now, standing in front of my old house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, deep sense of closure, tempered by relief in the weight of all the lessons we had both learned. The yard, once overgrown and neglected, was clean. The weeds had been pulled, the flower beds carefully tended. The porch, which had once creaked under the weight of neglect, had been repaired, sturdy and welcoming. The windows gleamed in the sunlight. The house didn't feel like a building filled with memories anymore. It felt alive, full of effort, sweat, and care, a living testament to what work and love can restore when properly applied. And walking beside me was Ethan, my son, not the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, but a man who had finally been tempered by life, shaped by the very hardships he had once tried to avoid. There was a humility in his step, a quiet strength in his eyes, a recognition of mistakes that words alone could never convey. He turned to me, hesitating for a heartbeat as though unsure of how to speak, then said softly, almost in awe, "Dad, I don't want the house anymore. It's yours. It always was. I just want a chance to make things right." Those words hit me harder than any argument or accusation ever could. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw him, the boy I had raised, the one who had once looked at me with admiration and trust, the one who believed in the father who had always been there, quietly, patiently, tirelessly, even when he had refused to notice it. The boy I had thought was lost forever was standing right beside me, not as a spoiled young man or a reckless adult, but as someone who had earned his place, not through entitlement, but through struggle, humility, and effort. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension and weight of 1,000 unspoken words pass through him. "You earned your place back in my life," I said quietly, my voice carrying more meaning than it seemed to, "and that means more than any house, more than any property, more than anything money could buy." We didn't rush. We didn't celebrate with loud words or dramatic gestures. Instead, we worked quietly together, repairing the last broken window on the side of the house. Side by side, we lifted the boards, hammered the nails, adjusted the frame, and finally stepped back to admire the work. The air was filled with a peaceful silence, punctuated only by the creak of the old wood and the rhythm of our coordinated movements. There was no boastfulness, no show, no false pride. Just two men, father and son, working together to restore something far greater than a building. It was a restoration of trust, understanding, and connection that had been fractured for far too long. And in that quiet, steady labor, I realized the full circle of it all. The house had been a battleground, a symbol of conflict and greed. But it had also become the place where lessons were learned, where patience had been tested, where hard work had proven its worth, and where bonds had been rebuilt, stronger and deeper than ever before. That day my son truly came home, not merely to a house, but to the understanding of respect, responsibility, and love that he had once taken for granted. He had been humbled, reshaped, and guided back to the path he should have followed long ago, and I had been there, silently ensuring the lessons endured. And as I watched him smile, not the smug, careless smile of entitlement, but the quiet, thoughtful smile of a man who finally understood, something deep in me shifted. I felt peace. I felt pride. I felt the steady certainty that in this life, no matter the wounds, no matter the betrayals, no matter the setbacks, a man is never useless so long as he has purpose, heart, and the will to rise again. Respect is not something you demand. It is something you build. And sometimes the hardest lessons create the strongest bonds. That house, that yard, that repaired window, they were no longer symbols of wealth or ownership. They were symbols of endurance, redemption, and the quiet triumph of patience and love over arrogance and neglect. And as Ethan and I walked slowly inside, the doors closing softly behind us, I knew without a doubt that we were not just standing in a restored home, but in the full circle of life, family, and forgiveness. A place where what had once been broken was now whole, and where both father and son could finally breathe, side by side, together again. Life has a way of teaching us truths that no words can fully capture, lessons that arrive wrapped in hardship, in disappointment, in the moments we least expect but most need. Respect is not a command. It is not something you can demand with authority, money, or status. True respect is earned slowly, painstakingly, through actions that speak louder than any claim, through patience that withstands frustration, and through integrity that survives the tests of time. It is built in quiet moments, the calloused hands helping another, the tireless effort given without expectation, the small sacrifices made again and again, not for applause but because it is right. And sometimes the lessons that carve the deepest grooves into the heart are the ones we resist the most. The hardest lessons, the ones that bruise, that humble, that shake us to the core, are also the lessons that forge the strongest bonds. They are the lessons that teach a child the weight of entitlement, that remind a man of his strength, that restore connections once thought broken beyond repair. And in this process, one truth stands taller than all the rest. A man is never useless. Not as long as he can rise when the world pushes him down, not as long as he has the courage to keep trying when failure has weighed him to his knees, and not as long as he carries purpose in his heart and the will to stand again. No title, no paycheck, no accolade can measure a man's worth. Only the persistence of his spirit, the depth of his heart, and the strength of his resolve to rise, rebuild, and reclaim what truly matters. That is the measure of a man. That is the legacy that survives, long after words are forgotten and time has moved on. And that is the lesson I hope my son, and anyone who hears this story, carries forward. The world may try to tell you your value is gone, your time is over, or your life is spent. But as long as you have purpose, as long as your heart beats, and as long as you have the courage to stand once more, you are never useless, and your story is never finished.